It's August 1st, 1946, Athens, Tennessee. Population about 14,000. On paper, it's a sleepy courthouse town in the Appalachian foothills. It's the kind of place where the biggest news of the week is usually a church social or a county fair ribbon being handed out. Tonight, it's a war zone. 200 men, most of them still wearing pieces of their army uniforms, fresh off the boats and troop trains from the Pacific and Europe. They're laying siege to the county jail. They've got rifles they smuggled out of the National Guard armory. They've got dynamite. And they're done asking nicely. Inside that jail are the ballot boxes from today's election. And the men guarding them are the ones who rigged it. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't hyperbole for my YouTube thumbnail. This is a real gunfight on real American soil, less than a year after the victory of Japan Day. Fought not against a foreign enemy, but against their own sheriff. They call it the Battle of Athens, and it's one of the most strangest and most satisfying stories in American political history. So why would a bunch of decorated combat veterans decide to go full high noon on their own courthouse? You need to understand the man who ran McMinn County like a Vegas casino runs its floor. And that man was a state senator and political boss. His name was Paul Cantrell. Cantrell had been sheriff, and then he was in the state senate, and through it all, kept a tight grip on local law enforcement through a rotating cast of loyal cronies. Most notably, his hand-picked successor as sheriff, a man named Pat Mansfield. Between them, they ran what locals called the machine. And the machine had a business model, and it was, frankly, kind of brilliant in a deeply illegal way. Check this out. This is crazy. McMinn County deputies, they were paid based on the number of arrests and fines they brought in. So they would arrest anybody for anything. Bus passengers just passing through on the trailway line were a favorite target, since nobody local would miss them and nobody would show up to contest the fine. Nothing says public servant like a sheriff's department that runs on a commission structure. Perfect. By the mid-1940s, the machine had been running the county for over a decade, and it kept itself in power the old-fashioned way, by making sure elections came out the way they wanted it to, regardless of how people voted. Ballot boxes would vanish, poll watchers would get roughed up, vote counts would happen, but behind locked doors with armed deputies. And somehow, every single time, shocker, the machine's candidate would win. Everyone in the county knew it was corrupt. And for years, nobody could do a thing about it because the people you'd normally call to stop election fraud were the ones committing it. Then the war ended. World War II, that is. And a few thousand men came home with a very different relationship to armed authority than the one they'd left with. You see, McMinn County sent a lot of its sons to fight in World War II. Many of them came back changed. Not shell-shocked or broken necessarily, but sharpened. They spent years being shot at by fascists in Europe and imperial forces in the Pacific. They'd led platoons. They'd survived Okinawa and the Battle of the Bulge. They understood better than most Americans would exactly what it looked like when an armed man uses force to crush the will of ordinary people. And when they got home, back to Athens, Tennessee, they looked at Paul Cantrell's machine and thought, whoa, wait a minute, we just spent 3 years fighting this exact same thing. So in 1946, a group of these veterans, organized as the GI Nonpartisan League, decided to run their own slate of candidates against the machines. Nothing radical, no armed uprising, no plan for a shootout, just an honest election. A guy named Knox Henry ran for sheriff. What a name. Other veterans ran for other county offices. Their entire platform essentially was count the votes correctly. The machine did not appreciate the competition. Cantrell's men brought in extra armed special deputies from outside the county, reportedly around 200 of them, many of them with criminal records themselves to keep order at the polls on election day. The GIs, having learned a thing or two about anticipating an enemy's next move, brought their own poll watchers. So tension in Athens on the morning of August 1st, 1946 was already sitting somewhere around a lit fuse. and nobody had to wait very long for it to go off. Voting started peacefully, though. But by the afternoon, machine-aligned deputies began harassing GI poll watchers, shoving them, threatening them, and in a few cases even pulling weapons. At one polling place, deputies arrested a black voter named Tom Gillespie for allegedly just trying to vote. And when a GI poll watcher objected, a deputy pistol whipped him and opened fire. Super rational response. Nobody was killed in that initial exchange, but word spread through Athens fast. The machine's men were shooting at unarmed poll watchers to keep them from witnessing the count. That was the moment this stopped being a political dispute and became something else entirely. By early evening, the sheriff's deputies had taken the ballot boxes, the actual physical evidence of who won the election, and locked themselves inside the McMinn County Jail, a squat brick building on the edge of town. They had roughly 55 men, guns, and the ballot boxes. Outside, a crowd of furious veterans and townspeople began to gather. And here's the detail that always gets me. They didn't storm off to loot or riot. They went over to the National Guard Armory, where many of them had served, and invoking their status as former guardsmen, requisitioned the weapons stored there. Rifles, a few Thompson submachine guns, and because someone in Athens apparently kept dynamite on hand for construction projects, explosives. Somewhere around 200 armed men surrounded the McMinn County Jail. And inside were the deputies who spent a decade robbing the town blind, and on that afternoon, opened gunfire on unarmed citizens. Nobody in Athens was going to bed until those ballot boxes came out. What followed was, depending on which historian you ask, either the last real armed rebellion against a local government in American history, or the most Tennessee thing that has ever happened. The GIs surrounded the jail and demanded the ballot boxes be brought out and counted publicly. The deputies, understandably not eager to produce evidence of the fraud they just committed, refused and barricaded themselves inside. And then shots were exchanged. For hours through the evening and into the early morning of August 2nd, gunfire cracked back and forth across the streets of downtown Athens, Tennessee. It's worth pausing here for a detail that sounds made up, but it isn't, I promise. At one point, the veterans outside the jail, men who had, again, very recently, had been handling literal military ordnance in combat theater, got tired of waiting. So they threw dynamite at the building. Yeah, dynamite. Nothing quite settles a disputed local election like explosives. The blast blew holes in the jail's porch and shattered windows, and reportedly the sheriff's men inside began waving a white flag not long after. Around 3 a.m., the deputies surrendered. They walked out with their hands up. The GIs took the ballot boxes, counted them in public, and in the open air where everyone could see. The GI nonpartisan league candidates had won, fair and square. Remarkably, given that this involved dynamite and hundreds of armed men in the dark, the death toll was low. Reports vary, but most historians put it around 2 or 3 deaths tied to the night's violence, with a rumor of injuries on both sides. It could have been way worse. In a lot of ways, it's a small miracle it wasn't. By morning, Paul Cantrell's machine was finished. Cantrell himself reportedly fled the county. The new, honestly elected officials took office. In Athens, a town most Americans have never heard of, became national news for a strange few weeks as reporters tried to figure out how a shootout with dynamite had broken out over a county's sheriff's race. There's a reason this story doesn't get taught much. It's not because it's not dramatic enough. It's because it's generally hard to know what to do with it. It's not a very clean story about democracy triumphing peacefully. It's a story about democracy getting stolen so blatantly and for so long that the only remedy left standing was several hundred veterans and a case of dynamite. Historians still debate the lesson. Some call it the last stand of frontier-style vigilante justice in America. Others call it one of the only truly successful armed uprisings against a local corrupt government in the 20th century. A case where citizens didn't overthrow the system, just the men who hijacked it, and then quietly handed power back to the ballot box the very next morning. Either way, for one night in August 1946 in a small courthouse town in the hills of Tennessee, the guys who just finished fighting fascism overseas looked at their own sheriff and decided they weren't going to let it happen at home either. Hey, thanks so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. I'd also really appreciate it if you just hit that like button And if you could hit subscribe, it's free, doesn't cost you anything. It'll just help me out a ton. Again, thank you so much.